In the spring of 2021, a wildlife biologist named Laura Steger was conducting a routine survey along the Des Moines River corridor in central Iowa when she noticed something in the canopy of a cottonwood stand that she initially declined to report to her supervisors. She looked at it for a long time. She took photographs. She went back the next morning and looked at it again. What she was looking at was a bald eagle nest, a substantial one, roughly 4 feet across and actively attended by a mating pair, situated approximately 60 feet above the ground in a cottonwood tree that stood at the edge of a public parking lot serving a mid-sized regional hospital. The nest was not in a wetland. It was not adjacent to a remote river stretch or a protected wildlife area. It was visible from the hospital's emergency entrance. The closest fishing pier was 9 miles away. The closest stretch of river with the kind of undisturbed riparian buffer that bald eagles had historically required for nesting in the upper Midwest was further than that. Steger reported the nest. She also noted, in her field documentation, that this was the 3rd such anomalous nest site she had encountered in the previous 18 months within a 70-mile radius of Des Moines. She noted that all 3 were in locations that would have been rejected as nest candidates by any ornithologist working from the species' established habitat requirements as documented through the recovery period of the 1970s through the 1990s. She noted that the birds appeared healthy, that the nests were well constructed, and that the pairs attending them were exhibiting the full suite of nesting behavior without apparent disruption from the surrounding urban environment. She noted that she did not have a satisfactory explanation for any of it. She filed the report and went back to her other work. If you have been paying attention to wildlife news from the Midwest in the last several years, you have almost certainly encountered a version of this story. Bald eagles nesting on light poles outside of stadiums in Milwaukee. Bald eagles nesting on cell towers visible from interstate exchanges in Ohio. Bald eagles choosing nest sites in suburban tree canopy in neighborhoods in Minneapolis, in Columbus, in Indianapolis, in cities that were not on anyone's map of bald eagle nesting territory a decade ago, and that were not on anyone's map of expected bald eagle nesting territory for the foreseeable future, according to the models used to track the species' recovery in the decades after it nearly went extinct. The phenomenon is documented. It is confirmed by multiple independent data sources. It is ongoing, and it appears to be accelerating. And the biologists who study bald eagles, the ones with the deepest knowledge of the species' ecology, history, and behavior, do not fully understand why it is happening. That is not a comfortable thing to say in public if you are a wildlife scientist. The admission that a species you have studied for decades is doing something you cannot explain fully is an uncomfortable one in a field where explanation is the product and where incomplete explanations carry professional weight. But it is the honest characterization of where the field currently sits with respect to urban bald eagle nesting in the Midwest, and the gap between what is known and what remains genuinely unclear is the territory this story occupies. Before going any further, subscribe if you are not already. What gets made here are exactly these kinds of stories, the ones that are actually happening in the field right now, the ones that complicate the clean narratives and require sitting with the uncertainty rather than papering over it. Subscribe now and stay with this one, because where this goes is not where you might expect. The bald eagle's recovery from the brink of extinction is one of the genuine success stories of American wildlife management, and it deserves to be understood in some detail before the current anomaly is examined, because the anomaly only makes sense against that backdrop. At its lowest point, in the early 1960s, the bald eagle population in the contiguous United States had collapsed to approximately 417 known nesting pairs. To put that number in context, the species had been present across the entire North American continent in numbers estimated in the low hundreds of thousands prior to European settlement. The indigenous peoples of the continent had coexisted with the species for millennia without significantly disrupting its population. 3 centuries of European-American expansion accomplished what those millennia had not. By 1963, the national symbol of the United States was functionally endangered in the continental United States. It was close to becoming something that appeared only in paintings and on currency. The causes of the collapse were not single or simple. Hunting pressure was real and sustained throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, driven by a combination of trophy motivation, perceived competition with fishing interests, and a general attitude toward raptors as vermin species that was standard in American rural culture for most of that period. The Bald Eagle Protection Act of 1940 addressed the hunting component, but the population did not stabilize or recover. It continued to decline. The reason it continued to decline after legal protection was extended is the reason most wildlife conservation professionals cite as the defining ecological lesson of the 20th century. The mechanism driving the collapse was not being addressed because it was not yet understood. The mechanism was DDT, dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, first synthesized in 1874 and deployed as an agricultural insecticide on an industrial scale beginning in the 1940s, accumulates in biological tissue in a process called bioaccumulation, and it concentrates as it moves up the food chain in a process called biomagnification. By the time DDT reaches a fish-eating apex predator like a bald eagle, its concentration in the tissues of the fish the eagle consumes is orders of magnitude higher than its concentration in the aquatic environment the fish inhabit. At the concentrations that bald eagles were accumulating through their fish-heavy diet in the 1950s and 1960s, DDT disrupts calcium metabolism in a way that produces catastrophically thin eggshells. Thin eggshells crack under the weight of incubating adults. Eggs that crack do not produce fledglings. A population that is not producing fledglings does not replace adults as they die. The math of population decline from this cause is slow but relentless, and by the time it was understood well enough to explain the scale of the bald eagle's collapse, the mechanism had been operating for roughly 20 years. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, made the connection between synthetic pesticides and the collapse of bird populations accessible to a general audience. The scientific understanding predated the book. The regulatory response followed it, haltingly at first, and then decisively, when the Environmental Protection Agency banned DDT for most uses in 1972. The bald eagle population did not immediately recover. Recovery was slow because bald eagles are long-lived birds with delayed sexual maturity, meaning they do not breed until they are 4 or 5 years old, and because the DDT that had accumulated in aquatic sediments continued to leach into food chains for years after the ban. But recover it did. By 1995, the species had been reclassified from endangered to threatened under the Endangered Species Act. By 2007, it was delisted entirely. The population in the contiguous United States by that point had grown to more than 9,000 nesting pairs, a 20-fold increase from the 1963 low. By 2020, estimates suggested more than 30,000 nesting pairs in the lower 48 states, with the population still growing in most regions. The recovery was celebrated, correctly, as a landmark achievement. It was cited in conservation contexts and policy arguments for decades as proof that the combination of legal protection, regulatory action on toxic chemicals, and targeted habitat management could reverse even catastrophic wildlife declines. The bald eagle became shorthand for the possible. It was the species you pointed to when someone said that wildlife recovery was too slow, too difficult, or too politically fraught to be worth the effort. The eagle had come back. The story was over. The species was recovered. The story was not over. What has happened in the last decade in the Midwest in particular is a second chapter that nobody fully scripted. and whose significance is still being worked out by the scientists watching it happen. The bald eagle has not merely recovered, it has expanded, and the direction of that expansion into urban and suburban environments, into close proximity with human infrastructure and human activity, into nest sites that the species' own behavioral history would have predicted it would reject, is something that the recovery models did not anticipate and that the existing ecological literature does not fully explain. To understand why the urban nesting phenomenon is genuinely strange and not merely a variant of normal range expansion, it is necessary to understand what bald eagles historically required for nesting and why those requirements were considered rigid rather than flexible. The bald eagle's nesting ecology, as documented through the core decades of the recovery period, centered on a set of habitat criteria that wildlife managers treated as effectively non-negotiable. The species required large, mature trees capable of supporting the weight of its nests, which are the largest bird nests in North America and can reach weights of a ton or more after years of additions by the same pair. It required proximity to large bodies of open water, specifically water with abundant fish populations accessible at the surface, which is the dietary staple that everything about the bald eagle's morphology and behavior has been shaped to exploit. And it required a buffer of undisturbed habitat around the nest site, conventionally specified as a zone of roughly 330 feet, within which human activity was to be minimized during the breeding season. Federal guidelines under the ESA formalized this buffer requirement during the recovery period, and violations of it were taken seriously by wildlife agencies as threats to nesting success. The buffer requirement was not arbitrary. It was grounded in documented behavioral responses. Bald eagles, subjected to human disturbance, at close range during nesting frequently abandoned nests, sometimes mid-incubation, leaving eggs or early chicks to die. They were documented flushing from nests in response to human presence, at distances that the 330-foot buffer was designed to prevent. They demonstrated nest site fidelity, returning year after year to the same locations, but they also demonstrated nest abandonment in response to habitat changes at or near the nest site, with a sensitivity that made managing human activity around active nests a significant logistical challenge for wildlife managers in areas with recreational or developmental pressure. The bald eagle's reputation as a human-sensitive nesting species was earned through documentation. It was not an assumption. It was an observed behavioral pattern that made coherent sense given the species' life history and the circumstances of its near extinction, which had been driven in part by direct human disturbance. The eagles nesting in hospital parking lots in Iowa do not appear to have received this documentation. The pair that Steger photographed in 2021 raised 2 eaglets that year. They returned to the same nest the following spring. The hospital, after initial uncertainty about what regulatory obligations the nest created, ultimately left it in place. Staff began monitoring it informally. The pair raised another 2 eaglets. During the second breeding season, the parking lot directly below the nest tree was in active use, with cars entering and departing throughout the day, with ambulances running their sirens at the adjacent emergency entrance, with maintenance crews working on the building exterior at distances well inside what the historical buffer guidelines would have required. The eagles attended the nest throughout. They fed chicks in it. They fledged 2 more young from it. There was no abandonment. There was no behavioral disturbance response visible to the observers watching from below. The birds appeared, to everyone who watched them, entirely indifferent to the human activity surrounding them. This outcome is not exceptional in the current data. It has been replicated, with variations in specifics, but consistency in the essential finding, across dozens of documented urban and suburban nesting sites in the Midwest over the last decade. Eagles nesting on cell towers in areas with high vehicular traffic and industrial activity. Eagles nesting in urban parks in Columbus and Indianapolis, where foot traffic passes below the nest tree daily. Eagles nesting on artificial structures, including power transmission towers, light standards at athletic facilities, and navigation beacons along river channels that run through developed industrial areas. Eagles nesting within sight of interstate exchanges in Ohio and within earshot of rail yards in Illinois. In case after case, the birds have demonstrated a tolerance for human proximity and anthropogenic disturbance that would have been considered incompatible with successful nesting based on everything the species recovery period taught wildlife managers about what bald eagles required. The first and most commonly offered explanation for the urban nesting expansion is the simplest one, and it deserves full consideration before moving to the complications. The simple explanation is population density. When a recovering wildlife population grows large enough that its preferred habitat becomes saturated, individuals begin occupying suboptimal habitat because the optimal habitat is full. Young adults reaching breeding age but unable to establish territories in prime riparian woodland locations because those locations are already occupied by established pairs, are forced to make do with what is available. Downtown Des Moines is not a bald eagle's first choice. It is what you settle for when the good spots are taken. The urban nesting, on this reading, is not evidence of behavioral change in the species. It is evidence that the recovery has succeeded so thoroughly that the species is bumping against the carrying capacity of its traditional habitat and overflowing into adjacent, less preferred terrain. This explanation is clean. It is ecologically sensible. It has the advantage of not requiring any new behavioral mechanism or any revision of the existing understanding of the species. And it is almost certainly partly correct. Bald eagle populations in the upper Midwest have grown substantially. The preferred riparian woodland habitat along major river systems in Iowa, Minnesota, Ohio, and Indiana is occupied at densities that would have been considered remarkable 15 years ago. The simple displacement hypothesis captures something real about what is happening, but it does not capture all of it. The complications begin when you look at the specific birds occupying urban nest sites. The displacement hypothesis predicts that urban nesters should be younger, less experienced birds that have failed to establish themselves in prime habitat because of competitive pressure from older, established pairs. Younger birds in suboptimal habitat should show lower reproductive success than older birds in prime habitat, because experience matters enormously in raptor breeding success, and because the resource constraints of suboptimal habitat should depress productivity. The actual data from documented urban nest sites in the Midwest does not consistently match these predictions. Some urban nesting pairs are young. Some are experienced adults that have relocated to urban sites voluntarily from less disturbed riparian locations, where they had previously nested successfully. There are documented cases in which established pairs with years of successful breeding history at traditional sites along undisturbed river corridors have, without apparent compulsion from competitive pressure or habitat degradation at the original site, relocated to urban or suburban nest locations. These cases are not numerous enough to constitute the majority of the urban nesting record, but they are too numerous and too well documented to dismiss as statistical noise. Experienced adult bald eagles, birds with every demonstrated capacity to succeed in traditional habitat, have in some cases actively chosen urban nest sites over available wild habitat. The displacement hypothesis does not account for voluntary relocation by established breeders. Something else is operating in those cases, and what that something else is has not been definitively established. The reproductive success data adds another layer of complication to the displacement narrative. If urban and suburban nest sites are genuinely suboptimal, compensating only for the unavailability of prime habitat and occupied primarily by lower quality individuals, the productivity from those sites should be measurably lower than productivity from traditional riparian sites. Lower fledgling rates, higher nest failure rates, lower chick survival. The comparison of productivity data across site types in the states with the most robust monitoring programs, specifically Ohio, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, does not show the expected differential. Urban and suburban nest sites in those states are producing fledglings at rates comparable to, and in some documented cases exceeding, rates from traditional riparian sites. This is not what the displacement hypothesis predicts. It is what you would expect if urban sites were not genuinely suboptimal from the bird's operational perspective, even if they are dramatically different from traditional habitat in their physical and anthropogenic characteristics. The food resource picture in urban and suburban environments offers one possible partial explanation for this counterintuitive productivity finding. The assumption built into the habitat suitability models used during the recovery period was that bald eagles in the Midwest were dependent on fish as their primary food source, and that proximity to productive fish-bearing water was a non-negotiable dietary requirement. This assumption was grounded in real biology. Fish constitute the largest component of bald eagle diet across most of their range for most of the year. But bald eagles are also highly opportunistic feeders. They eat waterfowl. They eat small mammals. They eat carrion. They steal food from other birds, including other raptors, with a behavioral persistence that earned them Benjamin Franklin's famous contempt and his preference for the turkey as national symbol. The opportunistic dimension of their feeding behavior is documented but was historically considered secondary, a supplement to fish-based diet rather than a primary feeding strategy in most situations. Urban and suburban environments in the Midwest, it turns out, offer a remarkable diversity and abundance of food resources for a large raptor willing to exploit them. The urban heat island effect and the alteration of agricultural drainage patterns across the Midwest have created and expanded the network of retention ponds, drainage ditches, golf course water features, and suburban lakes that dot the developed landscape throughout the region. These water bodies are small and heavily used by humans, characteristics that would historically have placed them outside the range of suitable foraging habitat for a human-sensitive species. But they are often extremely productive, stocked with fish in some cases, supporting abundant populations of carp, channel catfish, and other tolerant species in others, fringed with waterfowl populations that have also expanded in response to suburban water feature proliferation, serving as congregation points for Canada geese, which are themselves a species that has adapted to suburban environments with such success that they represent a nuisance management challenge for municipalities across the region, and which are, from a bald eagle's dietary perspective, a large and relatively accessible food resource. The roadkill dimension of urban foraging has received less formal research attention than it deserves, but appears in field observations with enough consistency to be taken seriously. Interstate highways and high-traffic arterial roads in the Midwest are effective killing grounds for white-tailed deer, raccoons, opossums, and other medium to large mammals that constitute acceptable carrion for bald eagles. The concentration of carrion along road corridors, accessible from elevated perches on utility structures, and light standards that eagles have proven willing to use in urban environments, may be providing a caloric subsidy to urban nesting pairs that partially offsets whatever dietary constraints the distance from prime riparian fishing locations creates. The eagles nesting near the hospital in Iowa's Des Moines River corridor are within foraging distance of both the river itself, where catfish and carp are present in commercially significant numbers, and of an interstate corridor with documented high roadkill density. The dietary picture available to those birds is not simple substitution of inferior resources for superior ones. It is access to a mosaic of food sources whose aggregate productivity may be competitive with what traditional riparian habitat offers. This reframing of urban habitat quality from suboptimal to potentially competitive for food-adapted individuals has significant implications for how the urban nesting expansion is understood. If urban and suburban environments in the Midwest are genuinely providing food resources adequate to support successful nesting by bald eagles willing to tolerate human proximity, then the expansion is not merely the overflow of a saturated population into habitat of last resort. It may be the early expression of a behavioral shift in a population that is, in real time, in the process of discovering and exploiting a novel habitat category that its own historical behavioral repertoire had excluded. That is a different phenomenon with different implications for where the trend goes from here. The behavioral tolerance for human proximity is the most difficult component of the urban nesting phenomenon to explain, and it is the one that currently lacks a satisfactory mechanistic account. The candidates are not absent. They are simply not established with the kind of evidence that would allow scientists to choose between them confidently. 3 mechanisms have been proposed with enough seriousness to warrant extended discussion. The first is straightforward habituation at the individual or pair level. Eagles that settled initially in peri-urban locations and experienced human activity without negative consequences progressively reduced their disturbance response through individual learning. The birds that learned to tolerate the hospital parking lot are not behaviorally different from wild eagles in their underlying neurology. They have simply undergone a specific learning history that has recalibrated their disturbance threshold upward. The chicks they raised at that site experienced high levels of human activity as normal conditions during their developmental period, and fledged with a disturbance threshold already adjusted upward from the species' historical norm. If those fledglings survive to breed, they may establish nests with less disturbance sensitivity than their parents' generation, not because they are genetically different, but because their developmental environment set a different baseline. This mechanism is plausible, consistent with what is known about learning and behavioral development in long-lived birds, and consistent with the general pattern of individual and developmental habituation documented in other raptor species in human-modified environments. It does not require genetic change. It requires only that birds in novel environments learn from experience, which is something bald eagles are certainly capable of. The second proposed mechanism is selective pressure. This is the one that the more evolutionary-minded researchers have been cautious about suggesting too loudly, because its implications are significant, and because it requires a longer time horizon than the current data can confirm. The selective pressure argument runs as follows. Among the large and growing bald eagle population of the upper Midwest, there is natural variation in individual disturbance sensitivity. Some birds are, by their individual constitution, more tolerant of human activity than others. In a fully saturated habitat context, where the most human-tolerant individuals are the ones capable of exploiting urban and suburban nesting sites and the food resources associated with them, those individuals enjoy a fitness advantage over less tolerant conspecifics that are restricted to increasingly competitive prime habitat. If disturbance tolerance has any heritable component, which is an assumption with some empirical support from studies of other species, but limited direct evidence from bald eagles specifically, then selection is operating on the trait in a direction that favors increased tolerance across generations. The population would, on this argument, be in the early stages of a genetically mediated behavioral shift toward greater acceptance of human proximity, driven by the fitness advantages available in urban and suburban environments to birds willing and able to exploit them. This is not a radical proposal in the context of urban evolutionary biology, which is an increasingly productive field documenting exactly this kind of selection in species from sparrows to coyotes to the fish populations of polluted urban waterways. It is, however, a proposal that requires careful evidence before it can be asserted about bald eagles specifically, and the evidence currently available is insufficient to confirm or reject it. What would be required is a demonstration that disturbance tolerance is heritable in this species, that birds from urban nesting pairs show consistently higher tolerance than birds from wild nesting pairs when tested in controlled conditions, and that the trait is distributed in the population in a way consistent with ongoing selection, rather than individual variation around a fixed mean. None of these demonstrations has been made. The research infrastructure to make them exists in principle. The work has not been done at the scale and rigor required. The third mechanism proposed is cultural transmission, which is in some ways the most interesting and the most difficult to study. Cultural transmission, in this context, means the social learning of behavioral norms across generations, with behaviors that prove adaptive in specific environments, spreading through a population, not via genetic inheritance, but via observation and imitation. Bald eagles are known to engage in observational learning. Young birds learning foraging techniques, observe adults, and refine their own behavior accordingly. The possibility that tolerance of human proximity is a behavior that can spread through a population via social learning, with birds that have observed successful urban nesting by conspecifics more likely to attempt it themselves, is consistent with what is known about social learning in corvids, raptors, and other cognitively capable birds. Bald eagles in the Midwest are not living in isolation from each other. They are concentrated along river corridors where individuals from multiple territories observe each other regularly, a behavior pioneered by a small number of unusually tolerant individuals at urban sites and demonstrated to be compatible with successful reproduction, could spread through the population via observational learning faster than either individual habituation or genetic selection would predict. This mechanism is difficult to test because it requires distinguishing culturally transmitted from individually acquired behavior in wild animals, which is methodologically demanding. But it is a serious proposal, and the one that some behavioral ecologists find most compelling as a complement to the individual habituation story. The reality is almost certainly that all three mechanisms are operating simultaneously, with individual habituation providing the immediate explanation for current urban nesters, developmental exposure providing a mechanism by which hatching tolerance thresholds are already shifting in the next generation, and the slower processes of genetic selection and cultural transmission operating in the background on longer timescales. The question of their relative contributions and their interactions is genuinely unresolved, and the uncertainty is not merely academic. Understanding which mechanisms are driving the behavioral shift matters for predicting where the trend goes from here and at what pace. The geographic pattern of the urban nesting expansion deserves extended attention because it is not random and because its non-randomness offers clues about the underlying drivers that have not yet been fully exploited analytically. The phenomenon is concentrated in the upper Midwest to a degree that is not explained by regional population density alone. Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Michigan account for a disproportionate share of the documented urban and suburban nest sites relative to their share of the total bald eagle population. States in the Intermountain West with large and healthy eagle populations, including Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, show the phenomenon at much lower rates. States along the Pacific coast, where eagle populations have also recovered substantially, show it at lower rates still. The Midwest concentration suggests that something specific to the Midwestern landscape and Midwestern human settlement patterns is facilitating the expansion in ways that are not replicated elsewhere. Several hypotheses have been advanced for the Midwestern geographic specificity. The landscape matrix of the region is one candidate. The Midwest is heavily agricultural, with a matrix of row crop agriculture interrupted by woodlots, river corridors, and human settlement that differs in structure from the continuous forest landscapes of the Pacific Northwest or the open rangeland and mountainous terrain of the Intermountain West. The fragmented, mosaic character of the Midwestern landscape means that urban and suburban areas are embedded within a broader matrix that includes the agricultural fields, drainage systems, and woodlot corridors that connect human-settled areas to the river systems and wetland complexes that bald eagles have historically used. An eagle nesting in a suburban cottonwood stand in Columbus, Ohio, is not isolated from productive foraging habitat by the same kind of hard landscape boundary that might isolate an eagle in a Pacific coast city. The permeability of the Midwestern landscape matrix between human-settled areas and productive wildlife habitat may be lower than in other regions, making urban sites functionally more accessible to eagles with traditional habitat associations than comparable urban sites in more geographically compartmentalized regions. The suburban pond network hypothesis is also specifically Midwestern in its application. The proliferation of retention basins, drainage impoundments, and constructed water features throughout the developed Midwest has created a density of small fish-bearing water bodies in suburban and urban contexts that may not exist at comparable densities in other regions' developed areas. Southern California's suburban landscape, for instance, is not characterized by the same density of permanent standing water as suburban Ohio or suburban Minnesota. The combination of abundant suburban water features with the winter fish kill dynamics characteristic of shallow Midwestern ponds, which concentrate vulnerable or dead fish at the surface and make them trivially accessible to a surface foraging eagle, may be providing a food subsidy in Midwestern urban environments that is more substantial than in comparable urban environments elsewhere in the range. The winter concentration dynamic is worth examining specifically because it has appeared in field observations of urban eagles with enough frequency to suggest it is a significant driver. Bald eagles in the Midwest are year-round residents to a greater degree than eagles in more northerly parts of the range, where winter ice-out dynamics drive seasonal migrations. Midwestern eagles that have established urban territories experience the full seasonal cycle in their adopted landscape, including the winter period, when rivers are partially iced over and when food resources in traditional habitats are most constrained. The retention ponds and constructed water features that dot the suburban Midwest often remain partially open through winter because of their shallow depth, the thermal mass of surrounding impervious surfaces, and in some cases because of aeration systems installed to prevent fish kills in stocked ponds. These open water refugia, in otherwise frozen landscapes, concentrate fish in small, accessible areas. Eagles that have located them and learned to use them may be experiencing significantly lower food stress during the most energetically demanding period of the year than their counterparts dependent on traditional river systems with more extensive ice cover. Winter food security may be a significant part of what the urban landscape is offering to eagles willing to use it, and the Midwest's specific combination of harsh winters and dense suburban water feature networks may make this advantage more pronounced there than elsewhere. The management implications of the urban nesting expansion have begun filtering into wildlife agency communications at the state level, with varying degrees of clarity and urgency depending on the jurisdiction. The practical questions are not trivial. When a bald eagle pair establishes a nest on a cell tower in a suburban commercial district, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act create legal obligations that are in tension with the infrastructure management practices and commercial activities of the site owner. The cell tower operator is not permitted to disturb the nest or the attending birds during the breeding season. This can create operational constraints that were not anticipated when the tower was built, and that require legal negotiation between the site owner, state wildlife agencies, and federal regulators. These situations have been handled on a case-by-case basis, generally with a combination of informal agreements to work around nesting seasons and formal nest monitoring requirements. As the number of urban nest sites has grown, the case-by-case approach has become increasingly strained, and several states have begun developing more systematic frameworks for managing the conflicts between eagle nesting behavior and human infrastructure use that urban nest sites inevitably create. The public response to urban eagle nesting has been, in the main, enthusiastic. This is worth noting as a factor in the ecological picture, because it has operational consequences. Eagle nests in urban and suburban settings attract attention. They attract observers, both casual and dedicated. They attract live stream cameras, installed by wildlife organizations and municipal governments, that draw tens of thousands of viewers during breeding seasons. The eagles nesting above the hospital parking lot in Iowa have a following. The eagles nesting on the light pole outside the stadium in Milwaukee have a fan community. This public engagement is not ecologically neutral. The monitoring infrastructure it generates produces detailed behavioral data that formal research programs could not afford to collect at the same density. Volunteer observers watching nest cameras have documented behavioral responses, prey deliveries, chick development milestones, and disturbance events with a granularity that supplements formal research data in ways that the scientific community has been learning to exploit carefully. Citizen science contributions to the urban eagle dataset are real and significant, and the public enthusiasm that motivates them has translated into political support for nest protection measures that has made the management of legal conflicts around urban nest sites easier than it might otherwise be. But public enthusiasm also has a shadow side in this context, and it is one that wildlife managers have begun addressing with increasing directness. The urban eagle nest, that becomes a local landmark and a social media attraction, draws not only passive remote observers, but also people who want to be near it, people who want to photograph the birds from directly below the nest tree, people who want to watch the feeding of chicks from a distance that the historical disturbance guidelines would have prohibited, people who, having internalized the narrative that these particular eagles are uniquely tolerant of human presence, test that tolerance in ways that cumulatively may have effects that isolated individual visits would not. The documented tolerance of urban nesting eagles for ambient human activity in their environment does not straightforwardly translate into tolerance for directed human attention focused on the nest. The distinction between incidental human presence that the birds have habituated to and deliberate sustained observation focused on the nest is a behavioral one that the birds may maintain even as their general disturbance threshold has risen. The management challenge is communicating this distinction to a public that has been encouraged by the live stream cameras and the local media coverage to feel a personal relationship with specific nesting pairs, and that may not intuit where the line between watching and disturbing sits. The research gaps in the current understanding of urban bald eagle nesting are numerous and consequential enough that they are worth cataloging specifically, because the gaps define the shape of what is not known and the directions in which investigation is most urgently needed. The dietary ecology of urban nesting bald eagles has been studied at only a handful of sites. Whether the food resource picture in urban and suburban Midwestern environments is genuinely competitive with traditional riparian habitat, or whether urban nesters are accepting real productivity costs in exchange for reduced competition for nest sites, is not established with the sample sizes and geographic coverage needed to generalize. The reproductive success data comparing urban and traditional nest sites is more developed than the dietary data, but still thin relative to what would be needed for robust statistical comparison. The genetic question, whether urban nesting populations are showing patterns of genetic differentiation from wild nesting populations consistent with ongoing selection on behavioral traits, has not been examined in published research at all. The cultural transmission hypothesis, despite its theoretical plausibility, has not been investigated with field methods capable of distinguishing it from individual habituation. The long-term stability of urban nest sites, whether pairs continue using them across decades, or whether the urban nesting represents a temporary exploitation of novel habitat that will recede as traditional habitat competition eases, is unknown, because the phenomenon has not been occurring long enough to answer the question with data. The absence of a comprehensive monitoring framework across the range of urban nesting in the Midwest is perhaps the most practically significant gap. Individual state wildlife agencies are tracking urban nest sites within their jurisdictions, with varying levels of rigor and using varying protocols. There is no coordinated multi-state database of urban nest sites that would allow the geographic pattern, the productivity data, the behavioral observations, and the demographic information to be analyzed as a unified dataset rather than as a collection of separate jurisdictional records. The information is being generated, in some cases richly, by state agency monitoring, volunteer observer networks, and research programs at individual universities. The infrastructure to synthesize it into the kind of comprehensive analysis the phenomenon warrants has not been built. The coordination required to build it runs into the jurisdictional boundaries and funding structures of state wildlife management, in ways that are familiar problems in North American wildlife monitoring generally, and that rarely get solved without a specific catalyst. The international dimension of the urban nesting expansion is an underexamined aspect of the phenomenon that deserves acknowledgement. The bald eagle is exclusively a North American species, with its range extending from Alaska and northern Canada through the contiguous United States to the northern border of Mexico. The urban nesting phenomenon documented in the upper Midwest has partial parallels in Canadian provinces adjacent to the Great Lakes and in parts of the Pacific Northwest, where urban and suburban eagle nesting has been documented at lower frequencies. The Canadian data is less systematically compiled than the American data, but is consistent in its basic finding. Bald eagles in human-settled areas along productive river systems are nesting in locations and under conditions of human proximity that the species' historical behavioral profile would not have predicted. The cross-border character of the phenomenon confirms that it is not an artifact of any single state's management regime or monitoring methodology. It is real, and it is happening across the species range in human-settled areas, with the upper Midwest representing its current, most concentrated expression. The comparison with other raptor species that have successfully colonized urban environments offers both encouraging precedents and cautionary notes. The peregrine falcon's urban colonization is the most celebrated example, and the one most frequently cited as a model for what urban bald eagles might represent. Peregrines, after their own DDT-driven collapse and recovery, demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to exploit urban environments. Skyscraper ledges replicate cliff faces. Urban pigeon populations provide abundant prey. The thermal dynamics of urban canyons support the aerial hunting behavior that peregrines depend on. Peregrine urban colonization turned out to be not merely compensation for saturated wild habitat, but a genuine ecological innovation that produced self-sustaining urban populations, contributing to the species' overall demographic health. The analogy to bald eagles is imperfect, but not entirely inapposite. If urban bald eagle populations develop the stability and productivity needed to sustain themselves across generations, they would represent a genuine range expansion into a novel habitat category rather than a temporary overflow from saturated traditional habitat. The red-tailed hawk provides a different kind of comparison. As a large raptor that urbanized earlier and more completely than the bald eagle, and that now exists in suburban and urban environments across North America at population densities that would have been unimaginable before the late 20th century. Red-tailed hawks tolerate human proximity, nest in suburban street trees and on building ledges, forage in highway medians and suburban parks, and appear to have established self-sustaining urban populations that are demographically connected to, but distinct from rural populations. The behavioral ecology of urban red-tailed hawks has been studied more thoroughly than that of urban bald eagles, and the findings from that research, specifically the documentation of reduced disturbance responses, dietary flexibility toward urban prey species, and high reproductive success in productive urban territories, provide a template for what a fully urbanized bald eagle population might look like. Whether the bald eagle is in the process of following the red-tailed hawk's trajectory at a longer timescale, given its larger body size, longer lifespan, and slower reproductive rate, is a question that the current data cannot answer, but that the current trend is beginning to make genuinely conceivable. The implications for conservation planning are significant enough that they need to be stated directly rather than left as subtext. If urban and suburban environments in the Midwest are becoming genuine bald eagle habitat, not substitute habitat of necessity, but productive habitat that birds are choosing and succeeding in, the management framework built around protecting undisturbed riparian woodland needs to be joined by a management framework that addresses the urban nesting context explicitly. The legal protections that apply to nests in both contexts are the same. The practical challenges of managing those protections are not. An eagle nest in undisturbed riparian woodland requires a buffer maintained by restricting human access. An eagle nest on a hospital parking lot tree requires a set of accommodations negotiated with the hospital's operations department, the Municipal Tree Management Program, the State Wildlife Agency, and the federal oversight structure, all of which operate under different authorities with different constraints and timelines. The regulatory and management infrastructure for handling this has been improvised on a case-by-case basis. As the number of urban nest sites grows, improvisation becomes increasingly inadequate as a management strategy. The public education component of urban bald eagle management is also underdeveloped relative to the pace at which the phenomenon is expanding. The millions of people in Midwestern urban and suburban areas who now live within sight or earshot of active bald eagle nests have, in most cases, received minimal formal guidance about how to behave in ways that support rather than compromise nesting success. The live stream cameras that have been installed at some high-profile urban nest sites serve an educational function, but they reach a self-selected audience that already has enough interest to seek them out. The far larger audience of residents, whose incidental outdoor activity takes them through the radius of active nest sites, has generally not received the kind of targeted behavioral guidance that wildlife managers in less populated contexts provide routinely. The message that even habituated eagles are not infinitely tolerant, that sustained, directed attention at an active nest during vulnerable breeding stages carries risks that ambient human activity does not, and that maintaining distance during the incubation and early brooding period matters even for birds that have demonstrated tolerance of general human presence, has not penetrated broadly into the communities where urban eagle nesting is now occurring. Developing the outreach mechanisms to deliver that message effectively to an urban audience that has no prior frame of reference for coexisting with a nesting apex predator is a communications challenge that wildlife agencies are only beginning to address. There is a broader story embedded within the specific story of bald eagles nesting in Midwestern cities, and it is worth making explicit because it changes how the specific story is understood. The bald eagle's urban colonization is one instance of a pattern that is becoming more common across North American wildlife, as the 20th century's framework of strict species recovery collapses into the 21st century's more complicated reality of wildlife populations interacting with a human-dominated landscape at every scale. The traditional model of wildlife conservation in which species are protected by maintaining undisturbed reserves of habitat and managing the human